For those of you who are joining us or have recently joined us and didn't quite get to see the very, very beginning, this will be recorded. Well, it is being recorded, and it will stay on Facebook after it actually finishes as well. So if you've got to pop in and out, we've still got a few more questions to go, but welcome. Pop your questions into the comments. If we've got time at the end, we'll get to those. But we're trying to cover absolutely everything here, and we've got a really great panel of photographers who have some amazing backgrounds in other areas as well. So yeah, my next question is for you, Amanda, because you had 15 years of working with newborns and as a nurse. So what do you think about photographers having first aid training? Do you think that it's something that's essential to undertake?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've got my cheat sheet here. I think that's just a no-brainer. Like, we encourage parents antenatally when they're pregnant to get a first aid certificate or do some CPR training. And, any baby that's born into the nursery and is admitted into the nursery, we do CPR training with all of those parents as well. I just think it makes sense to do it. Like, you're with such a vulnerable population that, you need to have that safety training behind you. If, like Rebecca said, there's opportunities where the parents aren't in the room or they don't have CPR training, heaven forbid anything happened to, this little vulnerable baby while they were in your care, you need to be confident that you can help them in their time of need. So, I think as a parent anyway, I have 2 little ones, I would want to do it anyway, looking after my little ones. But certainly when you're with little babies, you should have CPR as a minimum.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One of my friends 15 years ago, I think her baby was about 9 days old, and they lived remote, rurally, and her baby turned blue.
Yeah.
And she didn't know how to do CPR.
Even if you're in a central location where there's an ambulance, the distance, for an ambulance to get to you, 3 minutes is an eternity with a baby that's not or, anything like that. It's just, you need to be safe.
And it can happen so fast.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and watching that time and not being able to do anything and feeling so helpless, I wouldn't think anyone would want to put themselves in that situation.
No, absolutely not. My next question is, how important is it for photographers and people who come into contact with babies to have their vaccinations up to date?
I think that, to me, this is a no-brainer as well. And I know vaccinations can be a hot topic. And I don't want to get into that as a health professional, but certainly, these babies, often you're seeing them in the first 14 days of life. They haven't had their immunisations. You're their first, some parents haven't even taken their baby out of the house. So you're their first person, they've had any contact with once they've left the hospital. And they are so vulnerable to anything and everything in their community. You may have been exposed to something. You just need to protect these babies before they can protect themselves. So certainly I would advocate for at least a whooping cough vaccination, which in Australia we give all pregnant women or encourage all pregnant women so that the baby gets that immunity in that first newborn period. But, you're working with them, you need to have that coverage as well. And, you can contact your GP and see and get your boosters so that your immunisations are up to date.
How often should you have a booster for, say, whooping cough?
Say every 5 years, they're saying now.
Yeah, right.
It is, the safest way. But yeah, if you can go and get your titers checked to see, if your immunity is up. And I definitely would recommend getting a booster. And even, some people are around that haven't had any immunisation, depending on where they're from. Like, I would encourage them getting it.
Yeah, absolutely.
To keep those little ones safe.
And you mentioned how vulnerable they are. That's why it's so important for us to not only, be aware of all of the vaccinations and the viruses and deadly sort of illnesses that babies can catch, but also just having a clean studio.
Yeah, for sure. I think, they just have no immunity. So they're coming into your studio or your home studio. They've got no protection. You have to be their, protection for them. So things like hand washing all of your equipment and everything in between each baby, being aware of if you've been exposed to anything your toddler has an illness, or you've been around someone who's had chickenpox, or even if you're just feeling slightly unwell, please cancel your session or reschedule your session, because something that you might get, subtly and might make you a bit of an inconvenience or feel a bit poorly for a day or two can be catastrophic to a newborn that has no protection. So,
Absolutely.
What you think might be a sniffle coming down, in a few days, or a cold, can put a baby in hospital and can be life-threatening. I've had lose babies from a cold. So it's just not worth the risk. So please, if, you take home anything, reschedule if you're feeling unwell. If you've been exposed to something, be honest with the parents. They're going to want you to be protecting their baby as well. They'll be, somebody might think they're a bit inconvenienced because they need to reschedule the session, but in the long run, protecting their little one from, goodness knows what is just, makes all the sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know about you guys, but I actually have a policy. So before any session, it's a requirement that if they are ill,
Yeah.
Even if they just have a sick toddler that's
Yeah.
coming into the studio, they have to reschedule.
Yeah.
Because if they come into my studio sick and I've got a client, booked in the next day or the next day or the next day, and I get sick, then, it can have that flow-on effect, and you can't be too careful.
And also letting them know, if they've had a session with you that day and then 2 days later or a day later the toddler comes down with a tummy bug or something, getting back in touch just to sort of say, heads up, Johnny has got gastro. Not that you, like I said, you're cleaning your studio and everything in between anyway, but just so that you're a little bit more overcautious that a bug has been through your studio space when you're going to have other babies coming through.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You just can't be too careful, that's for sure. So, all right, we're getting through our questions and so much amazing advice is coming out. So for Luisa, when you're working with newborns, what are some of the key indicators, to identifying that something just isn't right with a baby, like if they're off?
Well, I asked my husband this morning, who is a medical specialist, and he said some of the things that you do that you don't realise that you're doing is that when parents come into your studio, you're actually taking a history. So he said 90% of a diagnosis is in the history. So what we actually are doing as we have our parents coming into the studio, we talk to them as they enter, we ask them how their baby was overnight. We're kind of taking our mini history so that we're already prepared for what we might also see presenting in front of us. So when my parents arrive in the studio, I talk about what the baby did overnight, how their progress has been, how their delivery was, whether they had a C-section, all the things that you think are quite normal, but all of these things inform us as to what we're also going to be looking for in terms of what the baby's behaviour is, if they've been going to the toilet, all those sorts of things, and feeding. So I guess the first part of that is getting that little bit of history before you start managing the baby. Also knowing if a baby does or doesn't like to be swaddled. Some of my parents come in and will say, look, my baby just doesn't like to be naked, really hates being chained. So all those little things I'll take into account during a session. And if they really don't like being naked as they're presenting, then I won't leave them naked at all. I'll just move into something else where the babies are more comfortable. The second part is that we use all of our sensory input to then be able to determine what's in front of us. So we use our eyes and we use our sense of touch, and we're using our ears as well. So when we're using our eyes, we're just looking for things that do present that they're changing. So if a baby's skin might be changing, the colour of the skin, all those sorts of things that to us we know are not normal. Redness, that could be anything. If babies aren't feeding well, we're probably a little bit more alert to look at their tummies and see how they're moving, see how their legs are moving, and really taking all those things into account so that when we're touching and moving the baby, we're actually taking all of those things in through the session with us. And when they don't present as something that we feel is a normal behaviour, then that's when we might respond, talk to the parents. And if we feel that it's out of our experience, then that's when I'll probably step outside of that and then say, look, baby's not very well, so I think it's probably in your best interest that we finish the session. I always know the limitations of my experience, so I'm not medical myself. So if something did present to be a bit concerning to me, then I would ask the parents that we think that perhaps it's better if they head off to a GP or go and see their doctor or anything like that. So especially if a baby's been crying for a long period of time, I won't. I hate to see babies crying. So a lot of the way I actually pose babies is very simple, because I actually really like to not have to fuss about with naked babies. So I've just really responded to really feeling how babies love to be swaddled. And so my style has kind of evolved from that, because I like to see them comfortable. But definitely I would never try and get a baby through 3 hours of crying just for photos. So I would definitely, if something is above a normal, what you would see as well as a mother, or you take all of your instincts as a mother into it as well. But anything that seems abnormal, I wouldn't be trying to push through with a session. I would be definitely discussing it with the parents. And say for baby, I had one baby that presented when it started crying when it was doing a wee. I found out a week later that the baby had a UTI infection, and it was really good to actually acknowledge what was happening while the baby was having that discomfort while it was actually doing a wee. So just really observing those things and actually telling the parent as you notice them, because that then informs them as to what they might do after the session.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
I love how you said that, you're not medical, and that's something that we have to remember, is that when we are communicating, and if you might sort of think that the baby has like a little bit of reflux or something like that, it's not up to us to diagnose that baby, is it? So,
no.
But yeah, like you said, it's using all of those sensories, which is absolutely amazing.
And the history as well, like knowing if a baby, I won't say, does your baby have reflux or colic? I'll just say, has it had some issues with wind, or is there anything? I don't like to just kind of lead into them thinking that there's something wrong with their baby. Sometimes I'll just ask how their night was, or if baby's sleeping well, and all of those things will just inform how, if the baby is a bit windy or has trouble removing some wind, then I'll just know that I'll plan my session around that, so that I'll soothe the baby in different ways so that they're more comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just paying 100% attention to them, isn't it?
And that's the other thing I was going to mention, is that I have, for 7 years, always worked with an assistant. And I'm not saying not everyone works with an assistant, but the way that I felt most comfortable photographing a baby was that I felt very disconnected behind my camera. So for me, and everyone will be different, for me, I felt very confident having someone else's eyes on the baby the whole time. And I think that's probably why when I was being creative, I'm probably a little bit more creative with my things than other people in the beginning, that I felt that because of my style of photography, I really needed to have someone paying 100% attention to the baby, so that while I might have been styling a flower here or doing this over there, my assistant's job 100% of the time is to watch the baby. And so she'll mention to me if she sees anything, which never anything is wrong, but it's always great to have that extra pair of eyes on the baby, especially if you're doing fussy setups.
Yeah.
Because you do have to have your attention over here. You're also touching things. So I make a point of fussing about with a setup. I'll go and wash my hands and then come back and then pose the baby, so that I've been touching bits and pieces. You might just lean on the floor. So I'll make a point of doing the setup, fussing about with those things. It's another reason why I like composites, because you can fuss about touching things and then you don't have to go and wash your hands. You just photograph the baby separately and you don't have the transference of germs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great answers there. So moving on, and talking about that communication that you've got with the clients and building that trust at the beginning by asking them and getting that history, leads me into my next question, is that, for Kristen, how do you build that trust and communicate with your clients prior to a session, just to prepare them for what to expect? Because we all know, we see these beautiful photos, and when you're not a newborn photographer, it's very hard to understand how those photographs are captured or how a session sort of goes. So I'm really interested to know how you do that, because you've got so much experience.
Sure, and this goes back to my human resources background, and our biggest thing when I worked in the corporate world, in corporate or in human resources, was setting the expectation. So that is like one of the number one things I do with my business, is set the expectation with your client. I never want a client to ask me how something's going to go when they're going to get their images. I want all of that to be presented up front, so that's established and they know exactly how everything's going to go. I communicate with my clients over the phone or email, depending on what they prefer, and I state out everything that's going to happen as far as from booking to when they come into the session, how hot, how warm I keep my studio, how long the session lasts, my workflow. I have them involved 100% of the time. And then I also invite them to come into my studio beforehand just to look around if they want to see the actual space, if they want to see the props that I have to offer. This is their session and the memories I'm creating for them. And I want to cater to them as much as possible. But the biggest thing is setting the expectation up front. I think that's the most important thing you can do with your clients.
Yeah, absolutely. It's answering the questions before they're even asked.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And just sort of a little bit of a follow-on from that, a lot of clients come in and they'll have a little bit of a series of screenshots possibly on their phone and things like that. And you mentioned it earlier when you were talking before about if you're not comfortable in doing something. Say, for example, they come in and they've got this very, very elaborate setup and they want you to create that. How do you go about communicating, to them what's involved with creating a particular setup like that, or if you're not comfortable doing it?
Sure. So before their session, a few days before their session, I do send them a client questionnaire. So I have an idea and I want them to be very specific on what they expect from the session. What are the most important images that they want me to capture? And if they are bringing anything special from home to incorporate into the session, this just gives me the opportunity to be prepared for what they're going to bring in. So if they do bring something in, it's just not sprung on me, and then I have to make a split decision at that moment. So say, for example, they want to bring in a prop that I don't feel comfortable photographing the baby in. I can pick up the phone, give them a call, and just let them know, be honest with them that I don't feel this is going to work. Maybe bring it to their 6-month session or their sitter session if it's a prop that I don't feel comfortable posing a newborn in per se. I'm just trying to give an example. But being prepared for what the client wants, if they're bringing anything in, and again, setting that expectation and just knowing everything up front.
Yeah, and communication is king, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's okay to say no if you're not comfortable. I think some people get quite scared saying no to their clients, but it's important that as business owners that supply a product and service, we've got to stick to, our own sort of standards and policies and procedures and follow through with what we are comfortable with, because it all goes back to that liability and things like that too.
Plus, the reason we're saying no is because we want to keep their baby safe. It's not because, we don't like that or, the primary concern is keeping their baby safe.
Yeah,
So.
and I think when you come from a place like that and you say in a very suggestive way, I feel that for the benefit or the safety or the comfort of your baby, and if you make it about their baby and you show them that you're concerned, they're going to trust you even more, which is exactly what we want.
Yeah.
And like, if I may just real
absolutely.
quick, and like you said, Kelly, they bring in images thanks to Pinterest that they see, but they don't understand what goes into that image, or if safety precautions were taken when that image was made. So just saying, you are the professional, you are the photographer, this is what you do for a living, this is your trade. So it's your responsibility as a photographer to say, like Kelly said, I'm not comfortable and this is why. And I find that when I do that, the clients appreciate it so much. And they say, you know what, you're right. I don't know what I was thinking. So just speak up, and we don't have to do everything that is asked of us if we don't feel comfortable doing so.
Absolutely. Yeah, I could not agree more. So when parents are... Oh, sorry, go, Rebecca.
I think the other thing... I'm sorry. I like to talk.
Go for it.
The other thing I think to add to that as well is explaining to parents that not every baby will do every single pose. So babies bend different ways. They like to curl different ways. And parents will always forgive their baby for not doing something if you explain to them. They won't be as happy with us as a photographer for not trying. But if you're not comfortable or the baby's not comfortable, you need to explain to them that that is just not the way your baby likes to curl or bend. And I think that's important to communicate that to them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. When someone asks for a specific pose that you know is a composite, and if they really want it, the response is always, well, we might leave that until a little later in the session, because then that way you're getting a better idea and a feeling, like Louisa was, saying before, about using that history and using your different sensories to see how that baby responds to touch and things like that, and different poses and positions. And then I sort of suggest that we'll see how your baby goes, but if at any point they become uncomfortable, unsettled, it's not worth risking, their comfort or safety for achieving that photo.
No, and as Amanda can probably comment on this, if a baby has, say, for example, been breech, then there are certain poses that they're not going to be comfortable doing. And if you're feeling that baby during the session and you're feeling tension in their muscles or their joints and they don't want to go a certain way, then it's your responsibility as a photographer to sort of point that out and to say, no, your baby doesn't want to do it.
Absolutely. So moving on, I've got another question for you actually, Amanda, from what Rebecca's just said as well, is that we often have parents that have premature babies or babies with illnesses. So when they come into the studio, how should photographers approach those sessions, and what should they know without having to be a medical expert?
I think the first thing I want to say is, regardless of your medical experience or your qualifications, the most important thing is to trust your instinct. So if you can see, like Rebecca said, a baby is not going to go into a position, or they're unsettled or uncomfortable, trust your judgment, not as a photographer, not as a nurse, not, just as a human, that the baby isn't going to tolerate that, and don't push it. Like, you need to trust your judgment. But I think with medical conditions or preterm babies, or, that opens up a whole can of worms. But you need to have comes back to clear communication with the parents. So in the lead up, sometimes you might know during a pregnancy, when a family has booked, that a baby's going to be born with a specific condition or be born early. Sometimes you don't find out until the baby's been delivered, but you need to have clear communication with that family throughout the process. So you know what's going on with the little baby, you know what they're up to. And then once the baby's born, you need to ask the parents for their feedback and the information that they've received from the doctors and the medical team about, what the baby can do or can't do, what specific restrictions that the baby's going to have, and any medical advice basically that they've been given specific to their baby's condition. But yeah, go back to using your judgment as well. I guess if you're seeing a baby isn't coping with something or won't go into a position, don't push the pose, or if you have a baby that has something wrong with its leg or its neck, then you can use your judgment to know that baby's definitely not going to like a certain pose. Don't push it or pause or pace during that pose. I think specifically talking about medical conditions, there's loads of things that could go wrong. Like 90% of the time, I'm sure most people have never had a baby in the studio that's had an issue, but lots of people have, so you do have to think about it and be prepared. So things like that can go wrong during delivery, such as a shoulder dystocia, where a baby's been stuck coming out the birth canal and has a sore shoulder. You need to be, wary of not posing them in extended positions. And the family, like I said, will have medical advice to not be extending the shoulder in that sort of position. You need to think about head trauma that's occurred during delivery. So if the baby's been born via vacuum and they've got maybe a cut on their head, you would think probably not to be putting anything on their head, bonnets and beanies, and being careful where you handle, the baby and their head. There's a condition called torticollis where a baby is born and their neck is quite tight. So, lots of our bum up poses, or any poses really, you want to put a baby in a certain position, they're going to have resistance against that position. So, be wary when you're moving them around. There's in utero conditions like breech, we already talked about, but, the baby's going to be super easy to have their legs flexed and love taco pose, but they're not going to like being extended in other positions. And then obviously breech babies can come in a brace. So if you've had open communication with the family in the lead up to that, you know not to take the brace off, or you know that braces can only be used in certain positions, and you need to restructure your session or what you're going to do, you know, during that time. There's obviously complicated things like different syndromes, or the baby may have had surgery and can't lay on their back. Perhaps a Down syndrome baby, they tend to be quite floppy, so you need to be wary of that, their tone when you're handling them and positioning them. They may come with medical devices, oxygen, feeding tubes. They may have dressings on wounds from surgeries. Some little babies have castings early on due to breech conditions or tight tendons. And then something simple which we sort of brought up before is reflux. Like they might not be medically diagnosed at under a week old of having reflux, but you sort of have a bit of a suspicion. Those babies are going to hate lying back on their back. So, you know, be wary. If you, every time you go to lay a baby down, if they're unsettled and crying in pain, try them in tummy poses or with their left side down, and that's going to make their digestion easier and make them more comfortable. And I think, you know, if you're pausing for feeding and that sort of thing after each feed, you're going to really, you know, see that really obviously after they've had their feed, their behaviour is going to change. And the other thing I quickly wanted to touch on, and I just wanted to say, all this communication with the parent is great, but you can't always trust parents' advice, because sometimes they're super gung-ho to get that photo, or, you know, no, baby's fine, they've got the energy reserve, you know, push on, I want the session done, I want this image or whatever. Goes back to trusting your own judgment. So it needs to be a collaboration between the medical information that they've shared with you, their information that they've shared with you of being this baby's parent for the last week or months or whatever, and then your judgment, you know, when you're caring for the baby. And I think being prepared, you know, having that in the consult leading up, you know, is really important, so that you're not, you know, getting in there and having all these things to suddenly think about, because I think if you're not prepared, then you risk doing something that might be unsafe to that baby. Just touching on premature babies, they're a whole different breed. And I think anyone that's worked with a preterm baby, they might be coming to you on their due date, or they're 2 weeks old, but they've been alive for 3, 4, 6 months or something like that. So there's a few special things to consider. Sometimes, I mean, I've shot lots of preterm babies, and sometimes they can sleep up a storm and they act very like a newborn baby, and you would really not know the difference. And other times, you know, it's a whole different session. So often their tone is quite different. They can be quite hypertonic, quite floppy, and they need a bit more support. So, you know, when you're putting them in props, thinking about putting extra things behind to support them and keep them in that, in a nice, secure, safe position. They often have less endurance for a session. So you're pushing on this 3-hour session. They just can't, you know, go through that. So if your sessions do take 3 hours, pace the baby, you know, go really slowly through your poses, pause for rests, pause for feeding, you know, that sort of thing. Just, you know, physically observe the baby and see if they're tiring out. Obviously, we've talked about this already, but they're severely immunocompromised. I mean, a newborn is anyway, but preterm babies even more so. They've often not had their vaccinations. They have no immunity to the big wide world. You know, you're that sole source. So everything you do and you put in place is going to be that little baby's bubble to protect them while they're in your studio. I think something that affects obviously normal term babies, but also more so preterm babies, is their thermoregulation. So we talked a little bit about heating your studio, but being aware of overheating or underheating and looking for signs that the baby is a bit mottled, or, you know, that they're not coping with it being too hot or too cold. Preterm babies have no regulation to, you know, control their own temperature. So again, you're the advocate for that. And then I just quickly wanted to touch on 2 other things that I think are really important with any newborn, but obviously a vulnerable, unwell baby, is smoking. So secondhand smoke through your skin and your clothes and that sort of thing. Most people obviously would think that that would be an issue for anyone, but it, you know, it's really harmful for newborn babies, but it can be catastrophic for a preterm baby or a vulnerable, medically unwell baby, especially a baby on oxygen. You know, it can be detrimental to their health. So obviously if you do smoke, you know, make make sure you shower before the session, and you're washing your hands, and you've put on clean clothes that you haven't been smoking. You might have gone out before the clients arrive. It doesn't matter. It's still on your skin. It's still, in your transfers through to your props and your blankets and that sort of thing like that. And I think, obviously, if the parents are smoking, don't, have them come back into your studio, because that's going to transfer through to the baby as well. And then we already talked about, if you're unwell at all, that I think is my big take home is that, if you really feel unwell, it's just not worth the risk. Those babies just rely on you and, everyone else to support them until they can support their own immunity. So you have to take every precaution under the sun. If you feel unwell in the slightest, just reschedule, small inconvenience for long-term results.
Yeah, I see that question asked in my group a lot. I'm not sure about you guys, but what
Yeah.
do you do when you're unwell? Well, obviously,
Yeah.
When you're hearing these things about newborn and preterm babies or unwell babies, and knowing that now, it's going to give people the confidence to be able to know, right, I'm not well.
Yeah.
I need to send them an email. I need to call them and say, for the benefit of your baby,
Yeah.
for the safety of your baby,
Yeah.
it is not worth risking
Yeah.
their health.
Oh, I feel like I'm getting a cold. I don't have any runny nose. I'm sure I'll be right. I'll push through. No, absolutely don't. Because while you might not be symptomatic, that bug is going to transfer onto that baby, and you're in close confines with the baby. You're transferring them, from bowl to bowl. They're touching your skin and your hands and that sort of thing. They just absorb anything you've got. So if you're unwell, it's not worth it.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I've cancelled sessions because my kids have been at home sick.
Yeah, exactly. It's in the environment. It's on you. You might not become unwell, but you're still carrying that bug or potentially carrying that bug. Yeah.
You just can't be too careful with
No.
these tiny little babies.
No.